I'm David Oberhelman. I'm in the OSU Library Research and Learning Services Division. And along with my colleague Barbara Miller in the back there in Government Documents, we are the ones who are co-organizers of this series, sponsored by the OSU Library and the OSU History Department. And with generous contributions from the Friends of the Library that provided the cookies in the back of the room. So we have cookies and lemonade. What we are going to have today is a little change in program from what was announced. Dr. Leslie Rimmel from History was to speak, but unfortunately a conflict came up and she won't be able to make it today. But we do have Dr. Joel Jenswold from International Studies, who is going to be representing us in our discussion of the Great War, World War I, and the Russian Revolution. And this is going to be one of the interesting programs here where we look at how the First World War impacted Russia, led to the birth of the Soviet Union, the end of the Tsars, and really changed a lot of the whole geopolitical landscape of the 20th century. So I'll give you a short introduction to Dr. Jenswold here. He has his PhD from the University of Kansas, and he's director of the academic programs at the School of International Studies, and he's a Humphreys Chair in International Studies. He oversees the master's programs and the undergraduate minor option in International Studies, and he has been on the faculty in the Political Science Department for 28 years, specializing in Soviet and post-Soviet politics. He also teaches courses in general comparative politics, political theory, international law, and international relations. And he has won college and university level teaching awards. His published work includes political aspects of media, international leases, post-Soviet political and economic transformation, and regional politics and security. Lifelong proponent of interdisciplinary approaches, Dr. Jenswold teaches courses with such a focus through the Honors College as well as in the Political Science and International Studies programs. So thank you, Dr. Jenswold.
Thank you, David. I'd like to commend the library staff for this series of the modern events, recent events. I normally tell my students when we study wars and conflicts globally, I normally say that, at least in my opinion, World War I was more cataclysmic in many ways than World War II, even though it was smaller in scale. The collision of the older ways of doing things, the old forms, the old processes, was especially sharp in that conflict. So it's long ago enough now, 100 years, that it's easy to forget, and it's the sort of thing that really shouldn't be forgotten. And a series like this helps keep things focused in our minds, and hopefully we can take away some lessons. Couple disclaimers before I start. As David pointed out, I am not Dr. Rimmel from the History Department. She was called away, and I'm also not a historian. Now, when I went to graduate school, my first graduate degree was in an interdisciplinary master's program and at the University of Kansas in what was then Soviet and East European area studies. Went on to get a doctorate, a second master's and a doctorate in political science. But as part of the interdisciplinary program, we did a lot of history, literature, philosophy, and so forth. So I have some background in this, but I'm not a professional historian, and we will not have with us the perspective that Dr. Rimmel, who actively and continually researches in this area, would bring, whereas I do not. When I went on for my doctorate, I thought I would do this great treatise on Marxist interpretations of something or another. I had this great plan. I ended up writing a dissertation on rural road development and networks during the 9th five-year plan. So much for grandiose ideals. I didn't make a lot on the royalties from that, by the way, in case you were wondering. I'm told it got some attention in the Soviet policy circles, but other than that, it's pretty well buried. But it was interesting, and it did give me a lot of insight into how the Soviet Union developed and pursued key policies in economic development issues. what we're going to talk about today, what I'd like to talk about today a little bit, is really the birth of the Soviet Union and the end of the Tsarist regime. And we've got an awful lot to cover here. And almost like no other place, Russia had a strong impact from these series of events. You went from early revolutionary movements, which I'll talk a little bit about just to sort of get started, through a series of revolutions, really. I mean, we talk about the Russian Revolution, but you can actually backdate that to 1905, and then during 1917, when the Bolsheviks finally took control and established what was eventually the Soviet Union, there were actually two revolutions. There was a Spring Revolution and the Fall Revolution, which brought the Bolsheviks ultimately to power. The Bolsheviks did not overthrow the Tsar. They overthrew the provisional government. So anyway, you've got these revolutions. You've got World War I breaking out along the way. Right after World War I, you have a civil war. You have foreign incursions, then you have a war with Poland. And then, icing on the cake, Stalin comes to power. And after that, of course, comes World War II and beyond. So it's been a rough road. And the birth and the change in this part of the world, the birth of the new system was particularly dramatic and particularly costly, both in terms of human well-being and human lives. So to get a little perspective, I'd like to back up and talk a little bit about some of the revolutionary movements that we see coming into the 20th century in Russia. You can actually back that up almost indefinitely. You'd be hard-pressed to find a time in Russia's history where there wasn't some or another kind of internal discord, discontent. Those who first put the Russian Empire together, you can date that to Ivan Grozny, Ivan the Terrible, which is actually not a very good translation, but that's another story, and his grandfather, Ivan III, Ivan Veliki, Ivan the Great. They had the garden variety conflicts with the landed aristocracy and the nobility, which are called boyars in Russian history. You fast forward into the era of the Enlightenment, Catherine the Great, and she put up with a series of revolts. But through that period of time, they were usually peasant revolts or cultural revolts of one sort or another, notably the Cossacks. That's not Kazakhs, Cossacks. So you've got this whole string of events sort of lacing through Russian history, but really, as far as the modern era is concerned, you can sort of peg this to the middle 19th century, actually a little bit before. The first significant uprising of an elite or a privileged class, once you get away from these old boyars from centuries before, is a thing called the Decembrist uprising, which happens in 1825. And in this case, I'll oversimplify here. Military officers from the nobility who had fought during the Napoleonic Wars and had been able to travel and experience things brought back all these ideas and resisted the Tsar's rule. And this kind of represented a significant uprising of an elite or semi-elite part of society against the autocracy and its practices of succession in this particular instance. At first anyway. So you've got that sort of thing going on, but when we talk about the seeds of the 20th century Russian revolutions, really you can kind of peg this to a series of movements starting probably with the anarchists. And you have, I'll just mention a few individuals here whom you may or may not have heard of. Bakunin is sort of the poster child for the anarchist movement in Russia. Nechayev also, these are both anarchists. Another individual who's not an anarchist, a fellow named Herzen, Alexander Herzen, who actually published a leading revolutionary newspaper. He couldn't do it in Russia, he was living abroad, called Kolokol, or The Bell. So you have these movements in place, and some of them have violent tendencies. Herzen, by the way, was the champion of what we might think of as agrarian populism. So he wanted to get back to what he saw as a more authentically Russian, culturally based way of living. That's something that's going to be important in succeeding decades. So you've got these individuals. Now, just to give a frame of reference, the two anarchists I mentioned, Bakunin and Nechayev, were both dead by 1882. And Herzen died in 1870. So that means everything that's going on in sort of this firmament of these sorts of tendencies is happening roughly between the end of the Napoleonic era and the end of, say, our Civil War, which coincidentally is also when Marx is starting to become noticed and do his writing and so forth. But these folks are not Marxists. That's kind of an important point. So you have these things going on all the way up through, especially the last half of the 19th century, and they're going to prove to be important as the scenarios play out in the future. There are a couple of other individuals from that era who are particularly noteworthy because Lenin picked up on these guys. One is a fellow named Chernyshevsky, who was actually Ukrainian. He wrote a thing called What Is to Be Done, and Lenin stole the title. It was blatant plagiarism. But Chernyshevsky was dead by then, so nobody cared. He was sort of pushing the peasant commune thing. He was a successor of Herzen's attitudes in many ways. And the other was a guy named Kachayev, Pyotr Kachayev. And Pyotr Kachayev put forth the idea that in order to carry off a successful revolution, you would need a vanguard elite. And the notion of not relying on democratic councils or sort of haphazard input from whoever wanted to get involved, the notion that you had to have an identifiable elite of dedicated professional revolutionaries to serve as what came to be called the vanguard is a key element of the Bolshevik organizational structure and a key to their success. I'll talk about that a little bit more later as well. As far as movements are concerned, and I'll just go through some of these quickly, by the mid-1870s, there was a movement called Land and Freedom, which is a manifestation of this agrarian populism I mentioned. A few years later, by 1879, you have a division in that movement between an organization called the Black Partition and the Will of the People. Now, despite the ominous sounding name, the Black Partition was actually the more, well, the least violent of the two. The Will of the People, or People's Will, sometimes translated, was overtly violent, and in fact, they succeeded in assassinating the Tsar in 1881. Is Alexander II. He was blown up in his carriage in St. Petersburg. They actually built a church, a Russian Orthodox church on the site. It's next to a canal in Petersburg. You can see it. It looks like something from about the 16th century, but it's was built in that style to commemorate the spot where the Tsar was assassinated in 1881. So it's a relatively young structure, and it's actually called the Church on Blood for that reason. In any case, you've got this violent revolutionary movement. Around the same time, the Emancipation of Labor Party is founded. This will be right at the end of the 1870s. And the leader of the Emancipation of Labor Party is a fellow named Plekhanov, and he is the father of Russian Marxism. Of all these groups and all these individuals I've mentioned so far, the only ones that you can clearly identify as Marxists are Plekhanov and the Emancipation of Labor Party. The Emancipation of Labor Party will go on to evolve into the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, and that is the sort of early stage Russian Marxist Communist Party. Even here you don't get a lot of consistency. In 1903, the RSDLP splits into two groups, both of which you've probably heard of, the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks. It's a little misleading because Bolsheviks literally means the majority, or the majoritarians. Mensheviks means the minority. And the reason that's ironic is that if you look at the membership of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, it was actually the opposite was true. The Bolsheviks just happened to have a working majority in the room at the time the vote was taken. That's it. So they called themselves the majority. They weren't. Didn't matter. So you've got, even within the Russian Marxist Party, you've got really significant divisions, both in sort of doctrinal or theoretical terms and in terms of tactics and strategy for bringing about a Marxist revolution. One of the members of this party actually wrote to Karl. He was still alive at the time. Basically said, hey, Karl, can we have a Marxist revolution here in Russia? And Karl couldn't read Russian, so he wandered off to study it for a while, and eventually answered. And his answer was sort of, well, maybe, probably not. Unless it serves as a spark or an inspiration for Marxist uprisings in other places. Because if you know anything about Marxist theory, you're supposed to have a proletariat. And proletariat means industrial working class. And Russia didn't have a large industrial working class. They had lots of agricultural workers. They had lots of serfs, which were sort of the Russian equivalent. They weren't quite slaves, but it was sort of indentured servitude of varying degrees over the previous centuries. They had a lot of low, for lack of a better term, agricultural laborers. They didn't have much in the way of industry, and therefore they didn't have much in the way of an industrial working class. So they did not meet the Marxist requirements for revolutionary conditions. Marx thought he would get revolutions in places like Germany, the United States, the UK, not Russia. But it was also supposed to be an international or transnational phenomenon, so if you had something resembling a Marxist movement in Russia, maybe that would inspire the working classes in the places where the conditions were more theoretically correct to go ahead and rise up and join in. That was the argument. But it brings me to the last revolutionary group, and it's really the most significant one that we're going to run into in a few minutes here, and that's the socialist revolutionaries. The last major organization that kind of comes out of this era into the early 20th century, they're formed in 1902, just the year before the Marxist Party goes into this Bolshevik-Menshevik division. And they're kind of the inheritors of this agrarian populism that dates all the way back to Herzen, I started talking about. They have their divisions as well. They have a violent tendency. And in fact, up until about 1909, between 1902 and 1909, they managed to assassinate a whole string of government officials, including 2 ministers of the Interior. And in fact, the situation in Russia is deteriorated to that point, to where at least in 1 or 2 cases I can think of where the perpetrators were arrested, they were acquitted, even though the evidence was actually fairly clear of what they had done. So that's the environment you're dealing with. You've got this revolutionary movements, there's a history of these, and what I want to kind of leave you with as a starting point is that there's all this history of violent uprisings, organizations of various stripes, pretty much none of them Marxist until around 1880. And that's not the major one, ever really. And that's all kind of going on in the background inside Russia through this period of time. Before we start talking about things like the downfall of the Tsar or any of those sorts of things. Well, okay, so moving along, there are a series of uprisings, some industrial, some agricultural, some just people in the streets worried about things like bread prices. And Baku, which is actually not in Russia, but it was in the Russian Empire at the time, sees some fairly major strikes in right at the end of 1904. And these are, I'm just hitting some highlights here. You could actually spend weeks going through and sort of tracking all the things that are going on through this period. The one that everybody kind of is aware of, if you've looked into this at all, even sort of superficially, is the strikes and the parades and uprisings in St. Petersburg in 1905, culminating in Bloody Sunday, which is an event where a group of people, citizens, are marching on the palace. The Tsar wasn't even there. And they wanted to present a petition. They were led by a priest. And so the idea was to march peacefully to the Winter Palace and petition the Tsar. Food prices, main issue. Head of the column, a priest. Tsar's not even there, but the palace guard opens fire on the crowd, which of course inflames things considerably. Following this is the sort of the signal event in the revolution of 1905. And it spreads through the military. If you're a film fan at all, you've heard of Sergei Eisenstein. And arguably his most famous film is a thing called The Battleship Potemkin. And Potemkin was the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet. And the film is based around a real event, which was the uprising of sailors on that ship. And they sort of took over the ship and took on, sort of backed down the rest of the fleet. And for a little while at least, purported themselves as an element of the revolutionary forces. These kinds of things are going on. They're going on in military units. The strikes are spreading. We'll skip down one here. Many of these revolutionary organizations start to organize what amounts to shadow governing apparatus. And this is a system of Soviets. Now, Soviet is just the Russian word for council. That's all it is. So you get a series of these Soviets, and the Soviets serve as sort of miniature representative bodies populated by delegates from these different revolutionary groups I've been talking about. Primarily, different variants of the Marxists and the socialist revolutionaries. And the socialist revolutionaries sort of take pains to broaden their appeal beyond this agricultural base. They're not Marxists, but they sometimes talk a lot like them and go out of their way to try and appeal to industrial workers and other elements of society. The upshot of this is that the Soviets are usually organized in the major cities. The two most important ones are Petersburg and Moscow. There are some in military units, there are some in large industrial enterprises and so forth, but they tend to be dominated by the socialist revolutionaries at this point, not the Bolsheviks or Marxists at all. So you get the rise of this sort of shadow governing apparatus. This leads to, or it corresponds with, consonant with the creation of some reforms by the Tsar. And in particular, the creation of a thing called the Duma. Now, the Duma is the modern name, or the name for the modern so-called lower house of the current Russian parliament. But this is the original usage. And the original usage was a consultative council that the Tsar put together. Kind of we might think of it as sort of a primitive, almost representative assembly, but it was a representative assembly. We did see the rise and participation of identifiable political parties, some of which were espousing values and programs very much like what you would see in a parliamentary democracy in Europe, Western Europe at the time. So that sort of came into play as well. So the point is that you've got the rise of this shadow system, but you also have major reforms going on within the governing apparatus. But unfortunately, the Tsar is not happy with the Dumas. So between 1906 and 1914, he dissolves 3 consecutive Dumas. So there are 4 Dumas. 2 of them in 1907 alone. Why? Because they keep doing things that upset the Tsar, so he keeps telling them to go home and changes the election rules a little bit, and we're going to try again. This is not a recipe for confidence in the system. right? So that's what's going on there. There are reform policies as well in place. And one of the themes I didn't mention earlier as we kind of go through these events in Russian history of revolutionary movements that I alluded to earlier and so forth, there's kind of a strange pattern of reform and repression. And you can track that through centuries of Russian history, where the Tsar, or later, you can even make this argument for Soviet leadership to a great extent, they try to loosen things up, they try to do things differently, they try to introduce what we might regard as liberalizing aspects either to the economy or the society or the political system or all of the above. And then things start to get a little out of hand and they panic and they clamp back down with excessively repressive measures. The prime minister during this period was a guy named Stolypin. And he's sort of emblematic of this pattern because Stolypin was a dedicated reformer, social reformer, liberalizer. At the same time, however, when the repression wave came, he got blamed for most of it. In fact, hangman's nooses for executions were referred to as Stolypin neckties at the time. So as people's expectations get sort of bounced this way, the reaction's not good, and Stolypin's eventually assassinated in 1911. So these are the sorts of things that are going on. Industrial strikes, social unrest leading to changes within the governing apparatus, but that never really stabilizes. The policy patterns of repression and liberalization, reform, repression, and so on, never really settles down. The rise of the Soviets as a whole alternate system of management and governance. And then on top of all this, we have the Russo-Japanese War, which by late spring, early summer 1905 is a major embarrassment for Russia. Virtually the entire Russian fleet is destroyed at the Port Arthur engagement in May of 1905. And there's even a racial overtone to this because this was the first time that Japanese or Oriental peoples had been able to decisively defeat a major European power. It doesn't have any direct bearing on some of these other events I've been discussing, but it does sort of introduce an element of national shame, national chagrin, if you like, and certainly a loss of confidence and undermining of any positive opinions of the leadership of the Tsar and his ministers. Was already having image problems, so to speak. All right, so that's sort of the run-up. Oops. Here's a slide that illustrates some of this period. This is a cartoon from around the time. That's the Tsar with his rifle, and he's facing, you can't read that from out there, I'm sure, but the fellow in the background says Japan on his hat. So that's representative of the war, and he's standing on a manhole cover that says internal discontent. And we've got our, looks remarkably like Bakunin actually, peering up from under with the round bomb. It says revolution, and then down in small print it says nihilist. And that's sort of the inaccurate part because by this time the nihilists aren't really a major factor. We're talking about much more organized programs of much more better organized parties and movements. But that's the way it's kind of looking for the Tsar and his allies. More, gotta mention Rasputin. I hesitate, if you know anything at all about this period, the two human storylines you've heard of are Anastasia and Rasputin, right? I'm not gonna talk about Anastasia, she's dead, okay? They finally got the DNA, got it sorted out, we know. All right. Really good Yul Brynner movies notwithstanding, not an issue. Rasputin was a real fellow, and again, he kind of gets picked up on in the popular media, and people write novels about him because he's such an interesting character. He's, by all accounts, a man of gigantic appetites in all things, pretty much, and really, really poor personal hygiene. But he was able to, it is true that he was able to exert a certain amount of influence in court because he seemed to have the ability to cope with the Tsarevich's hemophilia. So the Tsarina, Alexandra, right, had a lot of faith in him. This didn't help because Alexandra was an ethnic German. So now you've got this crazed monk advising the German Tsarina, and this doesn't do a lot for popular confidence or support for the regime either. Rasputin was only influential for a few years. It's only 1912 that he really arrives with any sort of influence or force on the scene, and he's assassinated by a bunch of disgruntled nobles in 1916. It turned out, in addition to his other noteworthy attributes, he was famously hard to kill. They did just about everything they could think of. They poisoned him, they stabbed him, they shot him, they eventually threw him in the river. And they got him eventually, but it took a while. Anyway, the public perception or reaction was not good. I mean, there were even aspersions cast on the Tsarina and her relationship with him of a particularly distasteful nature, if you catch my drift. So this was not a good thing from the point of view of bolstering public confidence or the esteem of the autocracy at the time. Let's fast forward a little bit to into the war era. By the time the war breaks out, we're seeing this pattern of strikes and uprisings and discontent. I've seen one estimate that says by 1914 and shortly beyond into 1915, around the time the war breaks out, you've got strikes and labor uprisings and problems in the countryside involving more than 2 million participants. I can't vouch for the accuracy of that figure, but it's certainly possible. It was pretty widespread. By July, Russia's mobilizing for the war, which breaks out in August. The mobilization process begins in July as well. And we move into the war at that point. And I'll come back to that in just a minute. Let's finish the rest of the revolutions. The war's not going well. More about that in a minute. In February or March, depends on which calendar you use, they switched. But in early spring of 1917, there were some protests again. It's actually called Petrograd by that time. They changed the name because St. Petersburg sounded too German. True. So in Petrograd by that time, there are some demonstrations and protests. These were mostly led by women, partly because the issues had to do with things like food prices again, those sorts of everyday how do we survive sorts of complaints, partly because a lot of the men were at the front by this time. But in any case, the garrison turns out, and again, I can't vouch for the accuracy of this number, but it's probably close, around 170,000 troops just simply side with the protesters. That's what provokes the abdication of the Tsar. And in March of 1917, the Tsar steps down and he is succeeded by what's just commonly called the provisional government in history tracts. Made up of members of the Duma, I talked about earlier, and dominated by members of a party called the Constitutional Democrats, who are the guys who are talking about something like a Western European parliamentary system. So they come into play. In the meantime, the Soviets haven't gone away. And in fact, the Soviets have become so influential that many historians refer to this period of time through sort of the bulk of 1917 as the period of dual power, because there were numerous instances when a local Soviet was able to countermand the government's orders. Still, it's not really the Bolsheviks who are calling the shots at this point. The Soviets don't get control of, so the Bolsheviks don't get control of the Soviets until into July, August of 1917. Lenin, I'm not going to spend time going over who he is. Lenin is abroad with other revolutionaries. The Germans, this is a famous event in World War I, the Germans actually arranged to have him return to Russia, not just him. There were actually a couple of carloads of these guys. Russian revolutionaries were sent by the Germans in a sealed train back to Russia. The idea being that they would undermine the war effort, which they promptly did. So he comes back. Lenin publishes and articulates what are called the April Theses. And it's really more like a manifesto. There's nothing in there that's of particular theoretical interest or that sort of thing. It's really more of a call to arms and an articulation of, sort of a rallying cry more than anything else. And the slogan that's most widely quoted and remembered from this is peace, land, bread. Well, by this time in the war in Russia, that's very appealing. Land reform had always been an issue. It's what provoked and sort of fueled these earlier agrarian populist movements I was talking about earlier in the first place. Peace, and then bread, of course, had been food prices in general, but symbolized in bread had been the spark point for both the 1905 and the spring 1917 uprisings originally. Well, by summer of 1917, there are revolts, and the Bolsheviks really do kind of provoke this. Lenin and his people get together and conclude that the summer of 1917 would not be a bad time for an uprising, and they are able to provoke a revolt. Why are they able to do this? Because by around this time, the Bolsheviks are getting a working majority or working control of the most important Soviets. And in particular, they've taken pains to organize in military units. So Lenin persuades his fellow revolutionaries, at least of the Bolshevik Marxist persuasion, that summer 1917 is a good time to rise up and try and overthrow the provisional government, and they try and it doesn't work. So Lenin flees to Finland and it's put down. Unfortunately, around this time, one of the Russian military commanders, a guy named Kornilov, is afraid of what's going on back in the capital, so he puts his army together and he marches on Petrograd. There is some speculation in some sources that this whole thing may have been a big misunderstanding or miscommunication between the military command staff and Kornilov. In any case, the provisional government essentially panicked. And their reaction was to free a bunch of jailed revolutionaries, allow the return of a bunch of exiled revolutionary leaders, and arm them, thinking that they would defend the provisional government against Kornilov. As part and parcel of this, that's why I say there's a demonstration of Bolshevik power. The provisional government actively sought out Bolshevik units, Bolshevik leaders, and not only released them, but gave them weaponry and allowed them to organize to oppose what they saw as a right-wing threat coming from the Kornilov's unit. In the event, Kornilov's unit fell into a state of prolonged confusion, and they all kind of sat down on the road, figuratively speaking, and had an existential crisis and sort of shrugged and gave up the whole thing. But the effect was the Bolsheviks are back. And Lenin returns in October of 1917, shortly before the seizure of power, which happens, again, October or November, depending on the calendar. And the Bolsheviks are actually able to mobilize and seize power, not from the Tsar, but from the provisional government. First in Petersburg, and then down in Moscow and in military units and other key positions. That's kind of the story of the revolutions so far in a nutshell. Here's Kornilov. He's the guy who's on the shoulders of the troops being celebrated. As for the war, switch gears a little bit here. That's the revolutionary background, kind of the string of events, presuming that most of you don't know that sequence in any detail. Change gears a little bit, the war itself. The alliance with Russia was initially with France, and this dates back into the 1880s. The Franco-Russian alliance, sort of the formal pre-20th century manifestation of that, is the Franco-Russian alliance of 1892, but France had been supplying Russia with massive amounts of resources, primarily in the form of loans, since at least the mid-1880s. And most of it was geared towards military or defense purposes. Not directly always. Railroads were a high priority, for example, but things that would have military applications. So France is essentially looking at Russia and saying, well, okay, here's an ally we can use to help constrain or restrain the Germans, but they're not in very good shape. Let's help them make themselves a little more potent. And that's going along at that time. So the French and Russian alliance dates back before the 20th century, and it really serves as the basis of the World War I alliance that gets Russia involved in the initial hostilities. But the key events really take place in the Balkans, and this doesn't get a lot of attention in sort of basic history classes either, but there were two Balkan wars, comparatively smaller ones, that predated the outbreak of World War I. One in 1812 and one in 1912 and one in 1913, and they are predictably enough called the First and Second Balkan Wars. And Russia's involved, especially in the first one. Russia is the patron, according to some sources, basically the puppet master of a thing called the Balkan League. And this is Slavic peoples in the Balkans resisting Ottoman control. The Second Balkan War is a little more complicated because members of the Balkan League fall upon each other. So sort of the standard narrative is that Russia, if not orchestrated, at least supported the Balkan League and supplied them and egged them on and so forth for the First Balkan War. Second Balkan War was an internal dispute in there that was a disaster from Russian policy perspective. But Russia's got a significant interest in the Balkans, and this is going to play in. That's really their primary interest in the war, when you get right down to it. At the time, they had the largest army in the world. At the outbreak of World War I, there were more than 3 million people in the Russian army. That was significantly larger than anybody else at that time. The equipment was not so good, but they were a force to be reckoned with. The Eastern Front, again, depending upon where you want to start and stop, is somewhere between 930 and 1,000 miles. And this was not the World War I combat front that you're used to seeing on the Western Front. This was not trench warfare. This was open field maneuver warfare. What people in the Western Front thought they were going to get and didn't. But that did happen in the East. Almost immediately, still in August of 1914, Russia launches a major offensive, which at first looks like it's going to be successful, but it culminates in the Battle of Tannenberg, which is a major defeat. And what happens from there on out is not quite an unrelenting string of catastrophes for the Russian army, but it's pretty close. Things do not go well. The Tsar is sufficiently alarmed that he actually goes and takes personal command of the army, which is probably not the greatest idea in the world, but he was the Tsar, he felt responsible, off we go. By 1916, this is just Russian casualties, and again, there's some disagreement and some variation in the sources on this, but around 1.5 million dead, 2 million prisoners, 200,000 deserters. It's probably worse than that. There were some successes. but they were limited. They were mostly in the south against Austrian troops, not German. And they tended not to be decisive or very long-lived. And just recapping something that I mentioned earlier, the Bolsheviks in particular had taken pains to organize within military units proper. So they were able to use those as sort of hosts for their party organizations and their programs. And that had an influence on morale and behavior and desertions and all that sort of stuff throughout as well. Here we have just again, another cartoon from the period, and we've got the leaders of the European powers sitting on top of a boiling pot that says Balkan Troubles. This cartoon actually came out in, I think, 1911, before the First Balkan War, if I remember right. So it's not that people weren't aware of this. Here we have some Russian troops. This is actually an elite unit, one of the Tsar's Guards units marching to the front. All right, so that's the situation with the war. It's not going well for Russia, and this internal unrest and this organizations of revolutionaries are getting a hold in the military as well. After the revolution, after the Bolsheviks are able to consolidate their power and do away with the provisional government, Lenin almost immediately issues a thing called the Decree on Peace, which again is more of a manifesto than anything else, but in it he says that he's going to abandon traditional secret diplomacy. He also renounces all Russian war debt. Things that are not going to endear him to the Western Europeans, right? So that begins to be a bit of an issue. I hadn't mentioned this earlier, but there was a representative assembly that the revolutionaries had put together that was supposed to run the country, at least for a while, after the revolution, and it was called the Constituent Assembly. And just like the early years of the Soviets, the Constituent Assembly was not dominated by the Bolsheviks. It was dominated by the socialist revolutionaries. So Lenin disbanded it. They met once, and that was it. They left and were not allowed to return. What Lenin decided that the Soviets, which were still in existence, but the Bolsheviks dominated them by that time, were a superior representative structure anyway. So did away with the Constituent Assembly, and the Soviet. This is the point at which the Soviets, which are already dominated by the Bolsheviks, become the main and durable representative bodies in the post-revolutionary system. And that survives all the way up to the collapse of the Soviet Union. There were assassination attempts. Most people have heard of the one, Fanny Kaplan, who was a disaffected SR, socialist revolutionary. There were actually two, both in 1918. The second one got him, and he was never quite the same after that. And we'll return to that in just a minute as well. Part of Lenin's decree on peace was making good on his promise of getting out of the war. So he had to strike a deal with the Germans, and the deal that was struck was the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which was in March of 1918. And I've got the main points there. They lost a lot of territories and resources. I'll show you a map in just a second. The Tsarist claims to Polish territory were renounced. Finland, which had been another territory claimed by Russia, was guaranteed its independence. This treaty was actually renounced even by the Germans shortly before the armistice, and before the November 11th armistice actually came into effect. And of course it was completely dismantled after that. But this is what you were dealing with. I don't know how well you can see that. I'll read it for you. The blue line on the map represents the furthest advance of the Central Powers forces. The salmon-colored territory is territory that Russia lost as a result of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk for that period of time. That red dotted line was the Ukrainian Republic, the westernmost border, just east of Warsaw, west of Brest-Litovsk there. I'll read this quickly. Remember, Russia's a really big place, but almost all of the population, industry, and infrastructure is concentrated in the West. So as a result of this, Russia lost 25% of its population, 25% of the railway system, 35% of the grain producing area, 70% of its industry, including 26% of iron and steel production and 89% of its coal mines. And they were fined 6 billion marks. That's a hefty price tag. So obviously that didn't persist, but that's what the Bolshevik regime was willing to pay to get out of World War I. Well, they got out of World War I, and unfortunately, that's not the end of our story. Right at the end of World War I, they are socked with another war, the Russian Civil War. And there was also a separate but connected war with Poland at that point. First, you have nationalist uprisings. During this period of time, the Soviet Union doesn't even exist yet. But there are discussions over what do we do with these former Tsarist territories of non-Russian peoples. And as early as 1916, there are actually a few before that even, there are some nationalist uprisings in some of these territories as the indigenous population explores the possibility of carving out their own territory and their own sovereignty. So you've got some of those going on already. Ukraine is a persistent problem. Nobody knows what to do with Ukraine, and that goes back to at least the 16th century. In addition, right at the end of the war, there are foreign troops that sort of stake their claim or move in on Russian territory, ostensibly to defend those national interests. But some of them were overtly anti-Bolshevik. The Americans sent troops, the French did, we did, the Japanese, there were Poles, and there was the famous Czech Brigade, which cut a pretty fearsome swath along the Siberian, actually tracks pretty closely with the Trans-Siberian Railway line nowadays. So they're dealing with that. Significant challenges to their power. And even if the foreign troops weren't bent on overthrowing the Bolsheviks as a matter of policy, they weren't doing them any favors either. So this convinced the Bolshevik leadership that the West was indeed out to get them, and Japan. This is the period of time when the Cheka is established. Cheka is the first Soviet-era secret police, precursor to Stalin's NKVD and the later KGB, or the domestic side of the KGB. So they're established and they're given extraordinary powers. This leads to a period which historians refer to as the Red Terror from 1918 on, which is basically enforcing Bolshevik authority and rule by very brutal means whenever it's seen to be necessary or advantageous. This also leads to the rise of a policy called war communism. And war communism is sort of the forerunner of collectivization and centralizing economic resources. Under war communism, the authorities went out and they had grain requisitions for the cities that they simply took from the countryside, resulting in famine in some cases. Also imposed governmental control, direct governmental authority and control over industrial production. All seen at the time, not as inevitabilities or as part of doctrine, but as a way of dealing with those particular extreme circumstances. None of this that we came to see as the mature Soviet system was carved in stone at this point. It all kind of evolves from these series of events, and war communism is sort of the embryonic version of the centrally planned economy that becomes synonymous with the Soviet system later on. Only it was much more brutal. The opponents to the Bolsheviks are collectively called the Whites, and this is an odd hodgepodge of supporters of the old provisional government, leftover monarchists, you name it, just a strange collection of people. Again, I'm not real confident of this figure, but most historians think there were around 150,000 to 200,000 white forces in play. Eventually, the Red Army is able to be mobilized, and eventually they have success in the Civil War. And the key figure in this is Leon Trotsky, who I haven't mentioned yet. After Lenin, he's the most influential. Well, he's actually a latecomer to the Bolshevik cause. He started out as a Menshevik, and the Bolsheviks got him on free agency. And eventually, they persuaded him that he should join their team, and turned out to be a good thing because he was a far better organizer and leader, at least in military terms, than Lenin ever could have been, especially by this time. In any case, in addition to his other roles and successes, Trotsky turns out to be the individual most responsible for organizing and planning the success of the Red Army during the Civil War. Most people thought that Trotsky was going to be Lenin's successor. Stalin had a slightly different idea, but that was the plan. All right, so eventually, by 1920 or so, and here you can play with dates, the Red Army succeeds in consolidating and securing control over the territory for the Bolsheviks. Almost immediately, there's another war, or sort of an overlapping war with Poland. And that's finally concluded in 1921 with the Treaty of Riga. You will sometimes see 1920 associated with the treaty. Depends on when it's negotiated versus when it went into force. So by 1921, the Treaty of Riga, which ends hostilities between the Bolsheviks and the Poles, is in play. And what this does, as far as we're concerned, is it cements the borders of Poland. And those don't change until the run up until World War II. So the Treaty of Riga is instrumental in identifying Polish territory, which, like Ukraine, had been under dispute for centuries, literally. It's finally settled, at least until the late 1930s. Here we see some Polish troops in the war with an American machine gun, as it happens, facing off Russians. Into the new decade. Just some quick events that follow after all of this insanity. There are rebellions against the Bolsheviks. The most famous one is the Kronstadt Rebellion, which was naval units, sailors. In 1921, early 1921, it's brutally repressed. I mentioned this earlier, the Soviet Union wasn't created until 1922. So it had not been decided or established what the organizational structure was going to be like, what we were going to do with these leftover Tsarist territories and former colonies and so forth. And the formulation of the USSR doesn't occur until 1922. And even then, many of the borders, especially in places like the Caucasus and Central Asia, are not settled. Some of them don't get settled until the mid to late 30s. NEP is launched. That stands for New Economic Policy. I mentioned a little while ago that war communism was not a policy that was carved in stone or intended to be a model for the future. The New Economic Policy was a policy that came out in 1922 with Lenin's endorsement that essentially allowed for limited capitalism, limited enterprise, ownership of land, that sort of thing. What we would regard, not really a market economy the way we define it in kind of theoretical or ideal terms, but certainly something more like that, and a backing off from war communism, and certainly not the centrally planned economy that eventually arises. This, by the way, will be a focal point in the succession disputes after Lenin. So, eventually the supporters of it lose, obviously. But you get this opportunity. The early 1920s, around this time, is really a period of sort of remarkable innovation in the young Soviet Union. Artistically, you see changes. Policy terms, you see changes. Social policies. The Soviet Union has a very liberal divorce policy. They're one of the first countries to legalize abortion. They guaranteed gay rights early on, in the early 1920s. Other things that go on that are obviously important. I mentioned the decline of Lenin. He's never quite the same after 1918 assassination attempts, but in 1922 he starts to suffer strokes, the last of which leaves him mute. He finally dies in January of 1924, but for about the last year and a half, he's mostly a figurehead. It's difficult for him to communicate. He has to rely upon his wife and his closest advisors to try and make his will known, that sort of thing. He's not effectual. He's not the old Lenin. Finally, in 1922, this is the year that Stalin gets appointed General Secretary of the Communist Party. And this is a disastrous decision. Nobody likes Stalin. So what the other Bolshevik leaders on the so-called Politburo, which was the highest governing council, what they decided to do was to give him lots of busy work. So they made him General Secretary of the party, thinking that they would just sort of be able to lock him away in a closet somewhere where he couldn't bother anybody. And what Stalin figured out that these guys missed was that as General Secretary of the party, he had access to the membership rolls, the finances, and the communication structure for the party. And he wasted no time taking advantage of that. Even in the late Soviet Union, never, nowhere did it ever say the General Secretary of the, not in the Constitution of the USSR, not in the party rules of the Communist Party, nowhere will you see an articulation that the General Secretary of the party is the de facto head of the country. It just sort of happened because of the levers of power that he had at his disposal. It stayed that way for the rest of the Soviet system. Stalin, of course, as we know, was able to parlay this into a personal dictatorship, the only individual dictatorship during the Soviet existence. You could argue about Lenin, I suppose, but this is the only clear-cut example of an individual dictator. Here we have a poster from the period of Lenin's birth and death dates. The scrolling on the bottom is just his name, is his signature. His real name is Ulyanov, and then he's got Lenin in parentheses there. I've been going on at some length here about some fairly complicated things. Let's cut to the chase and talk a little bit about the relationship between the revolution and the war. And I've tried to phrase this as questions, simple, straightforward questions. So did the instability and revolution in Russia contribute to the outbreak of the war? Probably not. The things I was talking about earlier as far as involvement in the Balkans and pressures in Europe and entwinements with France through the alliance that dates back to the late 19th century, that really amounted to the contributing factors. An ongoing obsession with Russia with trying to deal with and undercut the position and power of the Ottoman Empire, probably more than anything else in straightforward foreign policy terms. So you had a lot of international considerations I've kind of gone over that really weren't directly related to Russia's internal turmoil. Turn it back the other way, did the outbreak of the war cause or provoke revolution in Russia? Well, it didn't cause it. I started out a while ago talking about this long litany of revolutionary movements and programs and individuals and so forth. That all happened a long time before anyone was worried about World War I, or threats from Germany and that sort of thing. And they were not motivated by foreign threats, the revolutionaries. Virtually none of them were. But it is true that the hardships of the war probably served as flashpoints for some of the demonstrations and discontents. You can't really argue that for the 1905 demonstrations, but you certainly can for the spring 1917 one, which led to the Tsar's abdication. And privations, there's a reason why Lenin's call to arms was land, peace, bread. And those were all tied to the war consequences. So the timing was right. And finally, maybe most significantly, did the outbreak and prosecution of the war contribute to the success of the Bolsheviks? And I would say, yeah, it did. The Bolsheviks, as I said earlier, were never the majority revolutionary party, not even among the Marxists. But what the Bolsheviks had was a structure and a program and an attitude that allowed them to maximize taking advantage of the chaos that the war helped produce, more than any other political organization in Russia at the time. So this I already mentioned. These increased hardships at home fueled support for revolutionary movements and undermined and discredited not only the Tsar, but the provisional government. Some historians think that if the provisional government had come in with a program to get out of the war, that it may have forestalled the second revolution. We'll never know. The Tsar became inattentive to domestic issues, which, as I noted in some of those earlier figures, were still going on and even accelerating. I mentioned that he went and took personal command of the army after Tannenberg. Bad plan. Panic over Kornilov, I mentioned that. Kornilov's attempted putsch, if that's what it was, instead of just a breakdown in communication, that was a direct consequence of the war. And as I said earlier, of the revolutionary movements, or anybody else for that matter, including the provisional government, it was the Bolsheviks who were best suited to take advantage of that kind of mess. They organized in military units and in the heavy industry, and they consolidated control in the Soviets, partly due to the war issues. The Bolsheviks didn't get full control of the Soviets until after the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, because a bunch of the socialist revolutionaries walked out in protest. And the outbreak of the war possibly forestalled reform efforts that may have worked, even under the Tsar. I mentioned earlier that Stolypin, after 1905 even, there were attempts to engage in reforms and liberalizing measures. Even before the Tsar abdicated, the war may have forestalled some of those increased pressures that made it, or at least led to the perception that it was impossible to proceed with those. Consequences and lasting effects. You can see effects of this even down in what's going on in Ukraine today. Distrust of Western European powers. I mentioned that. Marxist-Leninist theory holds that the capitalists are going to be out to get us, and the events towards the end and right after World War I convinced the Bolshevik leadership that, yeah, in fact, that's true. And they never quite got over it. Exacerbation of tensions with Ukraine, Poland, and the Baltics. I didn't mention them, but they sort of figured into some of these machinations as well. The massive economic and demographic losses I already mentioned, and it really did set the stage for Stalin. Three of the catchphrases or policies that are most commonly associated with Stalin are the capitalist encirclement, which is an articulation of this distrust I mentioned a minute ago. Socialism in one country. Remember, Marxism and even Marxism-Leninism is supposed to be this international phenomenon. Stalin comes back and he backs away from that almost entirely. In fact, this is a major dispute between him and Trotsky. Trotsky loses, not to give away the plot, but Stalin says, no, we have to build socialism here. We got to worry about building up Soviet power or USSR power. And the 5-year plans and the collective 5-year plans is comprehensive, but initially mostly dealt with rapid, heavy industrialization. Collectivization refers to rural production and creating what were called collective farms, and eventually state farms, which are a little bit different, but large mega agricultural complexes. These are part of the comprehensive centrally planned economy. That's stuff that came out of Stalin. as a reaction to the events and instabilities that flowed out of World War I and through the Civil War and beyond. And it's kind of a final thing. Here's a poster from the early 1930s. It just says, "To the defense of the USSR." And it's sort of a stylized airplanes and soldiers marching from the factories out to defend what they saw as an increasingly virile threat from a hostile capitalist world. That's what I have for you. I have a few remarks about sources and so forth if you'd like to hear them, but I've more than exceeded my time already. So thank you for your attention, and I hope, if nothing else, I managed to impress upon you the complexity of these events and their interactions. So thank you very much. I'll be happy to take questions.